Well, welcome. Thank you
you.
for coming. So I'm Matthew Barlow. I'm the Humanities Coordinator here. Just a few things before we start. Thank you, Maddie. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that we are on stolen Nipmuc land. The Nipmuc no longer are with us. They're victims of imperialism and internecine warfare. We have worked with the Nolambika Project to acknowledge that history, and we need to do more than just acknowledge it. We have to actually do something about it. We have to get involved. We have to work with our Indigenous neighbors who have not gone anywhere to, well, ease their passage in American life. I'll also point out we have an exit in the front. We have an emergency exit around behind me through the basement, and where does it come out?
Where the
In the
front
front.
goes out, so use the
So
front.
basically run out the front door if something happens. And finally, this program is made possible by Mass Humanities and the Mass Cultural Council. I think I remember everything.
And Markham Nathan.
Oh, and the Markham Nathan Fund.
Fund for
Yes,
social
cannot forget
justice.
them. Funding social justice, fight the power. So without further ado, this is Ben Gagnon, who is a longtime journalist, award-winning journalist, if I remember correctly, author of Church of Birds,
That's
it's
right.
called,
Yep.
which I think is a brilliant title.
Okay.
Ben just sent me an email, and we got together, we talked about this, and I'm an historian by training, and I'm like, yeah, this actually makes good sense to me. So, it's all
Okay.
yours.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Appreciate it. This will be probably about half an hour material or so. I'm going to sort of put a break in the middle just to take any questions that there might be. But I'm just going to get right to it. And this story begins a long time ago. So we'll start with the chimps, our closest genetic relatives. And their homeland is Equatorial Africa. And one of the lesser known facts about them is that they live in the largest seasonal grounds for migratory birds in the world. I'm going to show you a few maps here. These are all birds from Africa. This is the Mediterranean Black Sea Flyway, and that's a very approximate bubble of where the chimps' homeland and territory is. But as you can see, there's a couple of 1-2 routes running through there, plus the active boundary, and all kinds of there's close to 1,000 different species of migratory birds in that area. And you can see another 1, 2, 3 routes plus another active boundary on this other flyway, East Atlantic Flyway. Even more birds. Each flyway carries about 300 different species. And this is the Asia East Africa Flyway. We add another 2 in. So there isn't anywhere in the world that has that many routes. And one of the reasons is because it's equatorial, and there's 12 hours of sunlight a day. So birds are very happy with that stable, large amount of sunlight. Come from as far away as Siberia. They come up from South Africa if it's too hot in the summer. And so it would have been, and remains quite an experience. Just hundreds of millions of birds coming and going from this part of the world. And this shows you the few places on Earth where you have 3 global flyways. There are 8 global flyways total. These are the areas where 3 of them overlap. So you have just an intense amount of birds. Huge breeding grounds up in the far north there. A little slice in Central America and Patagonia, but you have this big corridor in Africa where you have 3 of these overlapping. That's kind of why those 3 maps I just showed you. And you can see that it's a corridor that goes all the way down to the cradle of humankind. And on this flyway, there's a route that goes, those arrows, by the way, those denote seasonal ground, right? A wintering ground, a summer ground. And you can see that that blue dot at the bottom is the cradle of humankind. So this, it's right on a huge seasonal ground for migratory birds. And these two fellas were found at the cradle of humankind obviously millions of years ago. And this phenomenon, I'm going to show you, keeps repeating itself. As you see in the north, in southern Germany, Bavaria, there's a blue dot up here, and that's also over here. And that's a huge seasonal ground. You can see those arrows. So this is a seasonal ground on one flyway, and it's also fed by another route here. And this is where this guy was found in 2015. And it was confirmed in 2019. It was bipedal, and by far the oldest bipedal ape-human hybrid that we know of. And you might notice this guy here. That's this fella, 6 to 7 million years ago, right near, again, that seasonal ground. It's a very big one right there. Also bipedal. And you might notice this clump of grapes over here. Again, these are two different flyways, but you find these bipedal ape-human hybrids clustered. You only find these folks where you have these multiple flyways overlapping. So you've got 600 species there. It's a far busier bird corridor than anywhere else in Africa, aside from the homeland of the chimps. You've also got these three in that same area that I showed you before with this stuff. You get Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, again right near this seasonal ground. And of course, these are the two different flyways. You can see all the space, all these places, perfectly fine, nice rivers and lakes and things like that. But these bipedal hybrids are only found in the absolute busiest areas of migratory birds. And they're all different. You have 6 different genera. All 6, Homo is genera. These are really different types of creatures. These aren't just the generic ape-human hybrid. They're all pretty different, but they all ended up in the same place as far as being in the busiest bird corridors that you can find. So how did they all end up there? Can't say for sure, but bird routes correlate very closely with volcanic areas, and those have sort of perpetually recharged soils from minerals in the groundwater. They have ash layers that resist against drought, so you've got a more reliable food source in volcanic areas, which is why those bird routes tend to match up with volcanic areas. Other reasons why is perhaps that bird alarm calls will warn of predators. I know you can go on a wilderness course in New England and learn bird alarm calls, if you want. So it's not hard to do. It's a recognizable thing. So to be amongst a whole bunch of birds when you are this defenseless creature that's 3 to 5 feet tall would have helped to have that advantage. And of course, as I think we've all noticed over our lifetime, scattering birds, kind of presage a big, huge, giant storm. If birds suddenly just leave the area and it's quiet, you kind of go, okay, something's coming. That's another thing that they would have understood and learned. And of course, eggs are a good source of food. So at the same time that all this is happening, I'm going to go back for a second to this timeline here. This is the outlier, is the Danuvius in Bavaria. That's the oldest one. But all these guys are all clumped up ever since about 6 to 7 million years ago, all here. And in that timeline, you get the genetic divergence of humans from chimps. And that included changes to the language gene, more synaptic growth, greater capacity for learning. Interesting studies in the last 10 years or so. MIT found that a linguistic study found language developed from imitating birdsong. And the one that's even more mind-blowing to me is the study at Duke that found that we have birds and humans have the same set of 50 genes, these same genes that are activated when birds learn to sing and humans learn to talk. And of course there's this little nugget here. We've all seen movies where someone signals someone with that would have been very helpful when you're again a defenseless 3 to 5 foot. bipedal hybrid. So yes, they're small, and the fact that they're all bipedal and they're all found on these bird roots made me wonder, well, perhaps they copied how birds walk, which is after all on 2 feet, not 4. And it also allowed them to go really fast. All of these creatures were much more mobile than any of us. I mean, they'd use their arms, very, very strong to swing through trees, and they could also walk and run. So they could cover all kinds of variable territory. So this is, again, the timeline and all the things that went along with it. Bipedalism, changes to the language gene, the possibility that there was some kind of bird call language going on, greater capacity for learning, and beginning 6 million years ago, brain size that's when it began to increase, sort of steadily and then ultimately really quickly with Homo erectus. So why did they do it? That's the $1 million question. We'll never really know. Of course, if they did in fact do this, if this thesis is correct. But there are some factors, there are possibilities, or it should certainly, whatever, if it did happen, wasn't going to be one factor that would have ended up causing this phenomenon. But I threw out a couple of ideas that are related to learning, since we are talking about the beginning of increases in brain size and increases in capacity for learning. Curiosity is being studied more and more these days as sort of essential to learning. So if you can imagine, again, living in a place where hundreds and hundreds of millions of birds come and go every 6 months, that alone could have been a source of curiosity. Where did they go? Where did they come from? How did they manage this? Hundreds of millions of colorful, incredible musical birds coming and going. This was cheating. I know this is, but it's fun. I mean, it's Curious George, and he's that's the definition of curiosity from these two scientists. And here's just sort of the proof in the pudding as far as that we're a curious species. I mean, 30 years of planning, $10 billion. I think there were more than 400 steps they had to take to get this all, to have it open up in space. And each one of those steps was a fail-safe. Any one of them would have killed the project. I mean, it was just a crazy thing. So I asked them, were you interested in seeing any of the pictures that they took? That's what I would ask the audience. And I was just, yes, show me, I'm curious. Holy crap. So we're a curious species. I mean, I don't think there's really any doubt about that. So it kind of makes sense that maybe that had something to do with following birds around. But this in particular might have a lot to do with it. And that this is a problem across the animal kingdom, where you have adolescent males and too many of them, and they're bugging the families and the established males and females and families. And there's this is what happens, is that chimps get expelled from the group. If there are maybe a bunch of adolescent males, they all get booted. And this is, of course, extremely dangerous. They don't have the protection of their tribe, of their group. So that would have put them in a situation where they kind of need to figure out who they belong to. And so maybe they decided to join the very, very successful creatures. And this isn't something that people talk about a whole lot, because imitation isn't necessarily a flattering thing necessarily, but it's crucial to learning, of course. It's how we all learn to speak and sing. And it turns out that humans are just off the charts as far as learning from imitation. Animals will learn steps towards a conclusion, as long as those steps are directly sort of linked to the conclusion. But people will learn all kinds of abstract steps, and they can do abstract rituals and pass them down for thousands of years, and they don't necessarily make any sense, but they'll still imitate them, which is the difference. And there's risk-taking, especially if you're an adolescent. I'm sure some of you folks in the audience might be familiar with adolescents taking risks. And that's something that's been studied more and more as critical to learning. It's not just, I want to make my parents crazy, or rebel or whatever. It's critical to learning, because it gives you, again, heightened sort of, there's a lot of study that's been done on sort of amplified learning that risk-taking goes. And we're not just talking about sort of sports betting here, where adults will do calculated risks, whereas adolescents will take risks that they don't know what's going to happen. And that really is a huge learning process. So if this indeed happened, if all these hybrids followed migratory birds, the entire process would have been just a series of risk-taking and learning experiences, crossing all kinds of territory, just sort of the original journey. And so we come to our hominins. Here they kind of where they fit into the timeline. And this is a map of a bunch of hominins in different colors, and you can see how nearly exact the correlation is with bird migration routes. And you can see all that space outside of the bird migration routes, they aren't there. It's almost exclusively found these fossils of all these different species on a bird migration route, or again in some of the busiest areas, like this here, Israel. We'll get to that in a minute. But over here you have Denisovans. This is Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains, and the yellow is Neanderthals. And again, just always seem to be close to a seasonal ground, or on a bird route. And it's just, when I put this together, I was even shocked at how close the correlation is. This, for example, is Kabwe in Zambia, where Homo heidelbergensis was found. That's right there on a seasonal ground. Again, this is the oldest Homo sapiens fossil at Jebel Irhoud, 315,000 years old, 315,000 years old Homo sapien skull. And again, it's at a crossroads of bird migration routes. So this is a fairly recent version of Homo erectus, twice the brain size, foot taller, less hair, arch speed. They were born to run. These just literally had a balancing organ in their inner ear that allowed them to focus on a distant target and run at it, and that was new. These other guys did not have that ability. So these, he and she were everywhere. They were all the way to Asia. You have Homo erectus there, Homo erectus in red, right there, there, all the way down to Java. And one of the fun parts about the recent studies of hominins is the Denisovans. I'm not sure how many of you've heard of them, but they are larger versions of ourselves, perhaps as going back as much as 400,000 years, with perhaps more like 200,000, but they're not really sure. This is Denisova Cave. Sorry, that's the Neanderthal. This is Denisova Cave right here. The purple is the Denisovans. And that is on that bird route, again, from three different flyways. They're very close to 3 different flyways. You can see that's another one. So it's very rare to have 3 bird routes kind of crossing, and that's where you find the Denisovans. And they also interbred with Neanderthals. And this is a recent reconstruction of Neanderthal woman. The big difference is that they were stockier than us. They had also big faces, big noses, big eyes, just like theatrical faces. And you can kind of see that from this reconstruction. This is a Denisovan girl that, of course, as close as they can sort of come up with. But the molar that they found was huge. It's hard to tell from this, but it's unusually big. And they lived in the mountains. This is just from last month, a reconstruction of a woman, 45,000 years ago in the Czech Republic. And Israel, because it's between 3 continents, you got Europe, Asia, and Africa. You got birds coming from Europe and Asia down to Africa and then returning up through, and it's like a bottleneck. And there just easily leads the world in bird migration, this tiny little country. And it also leads the world in the number of different hominids that you can find. And a lot of this is just recently sort of either old evidence that was reanalyzed or new findings. And so up here you have Homo heidelbergensis, you've got Homo erectus, hunting elephants in the Upper Galilee and just below at Ubadiah. And this green Homo sapiens, that's almost 200,000-year-old early modern Homo sapiens. These folks are between 200 and 420,000 years old, and this is between 120 and 140,000 years old. And they're all sort of mixtures of features of Heidelbergensis and Neanderthal and Homo sapien. And these are, the yellow are Neanderthal. Here, they buried children in a cave with red deer. And it's it really is the cradle of the Homo genus, is Israel. And this is kind of new news, because there isn't like a tracking place that says, here's where you go to find out where all the latest fossil finds are. But if you keep track of it a lot of these are in the last 4 or 5 years that this evidence has turned up. And it's really because, in my mind, if you're following birds around, it makes sense that you'll find all of this in the bottleneck between 3 continents, along with the most migratory birds in the world, again by far. So this is the first break for questions. If it's a minimal audience, but if you have any questions at this point as to whether this is nutty or not, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll move on. Okay. So it turns out that birds carry seeds. This is something that was found to be true in a study in 2016, based on a bunch of scientists going to the Canary Islands. The Eleanor falcon is a predator that preys on incoming migratory birds from Europe, and they pile them up out next near their nests. And so the scientists went to the piles of dead migratory birds and took out their alimentary canals and brought them back to the lab and left the rest of the bodies for the falcons, which I thought was nice. They found out that 1.7% of the birds had viable seeds in their stomachs. That is way more than enough to affect the floral diversity on their seasonal grounds and in between their seasonal grounds. So they're carrying seeds from many hundreds of miles away between the 2 places. So where their seasonal grounds are is going to have more vegetation and more varied vegetation than anywhere else. And that's something that our ancestors probably noticed. It's like, this is a little Garden of Eden. This is something that Charles Darwin believed. He thought it was the case, but it was very hard to prove, as you can imagine. But he was not the first to see this link. This is a legend from ancient China, where the phoenix drops grain to the ground, which immediately starts to grow. And this is found in pretty much every culture that I tried to find. You'll find the same belief that birds brought the seeds to the soil. And these are in creation stories in ancient and indigenous cultures around the world. In the United States, here are 3 examples. I love the one in the Caribbean where hummingbirds brought tobacco seeds from the heavens. White Mountain Apache saves the turkeys, giving hungry young children the seeds to plant. The Algonquin with crows. And the Hadassah, they had it really figured, where they had different species of different seeds that they each brought. I mean, so this was well known across the world, that birds carried seeds. And as you can imagine, it's pretty important fact to know, because if you follow them, you're going to end up in a nice place, basically. It's like if it's, there's sort of a life period. Oh, of course, the Greek one, that many people might have heard. Again, the same concept. So, the first farmers, what were they up to? It looks very much like, as you can see in this Mesopotamian motif, that they had a firm grip on the idea that birds carried seeds. So there's your bird god with the seeds that he's planting. So imitation again comes into play here. And here's Enlil and Enki, the twin Sumerian creator gods. with a lot of birds and seeds and tending of plants going on with these guys. And the whole story of creating humans for the Sumerian was that humans were going to take over the job of lesser god. The job was tending the gardens of the earth. Humans were going to be farmers now. It wasn't going to be birds because they were tired of it and they were complaining to Enlil and Enki, we're tired of doing this, we'll make a new being to spread the seeds around. And so that's, initially Enlil was not happy with the humans and he sent a big flood, and his brother Enki was not as much of a jerk, and he saved this Sumerian Noah, and they landed on a volcanic slope. And this is them landing on the volcanic slope, where Enki taught them to farm. So he succeeded, after all, in the goal, which was to create a new being that would plant seeds in the spring instead of birds, or in addition to birds. And amazingly enough, there is a volcano in southeastern Turkey in Anatolia where the ancient Sumerians lived before they moved sort of southeast through Mesopotamia, where there's more than 60 different plants that originated as wild plants on this volcano and that are now found as domesticated plants across the Fertile Crescent. So that suggests that that was the nursery, the original nursery. And Göbekli Tepe, the oldest megalith in the world, is just south of Karakodag, and it was built roughly 11,500 years ago. You can see that egg-like structure, which is one of many egg-like stone enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, and then just south of that is the first farming village in the Near East, which is Abu Huraira, right there. This blue dot encompasses both Karakodag and Göbekli Tepe, and on the same route, that's the first farming village right there. So it suggests that Karakodag was the sort of the first nursery, and that it all ties in with bird migration routes. A lot of circumstantial evidence, but it kind of lines up fairly well, I think. And then here's another famous myth: the Greek goddess Persephone, who spends every winter in Hades, where she eats this seed-filled fruit, and then returns every spring. And her mother is worried about her, and goes to try to find her and stuff like that. But this is every single year, so I don't know how worried she could be, because she would keep coming back every single year, and spend the winter in somewhere else and come back with all the seeds. And it's like, well, okay, that looks like it might be about birds, right? It's possible that this could be about migratory birds. Well, if you look at the temples to Demeter and Persephone, they're all built at takeoff and landing routes throughout the Mediterranean area. So these are all temples. That's the ancient city of Cyrene right there. This is Naxos. I always forget this one. Sozopol, Bulgaria, Syracuse, and ancient city of Carthage. And so it looks like they were celebrating them arriving or taking off as migratory birds. I should probably note that ornithologists believe these routes haven't changed for forever. These are the most efficient routes that birds would take, and therefore they don't change. So it's like a window into the past. Probably should have started with that. Something similar to what happened in the Fertile Crescent happened in Peru. This is a fairly recent study that was found where the nursery of domesticated manioc, peanuts, coca, and tobacco, all in this area here, in the highlands of the Andes in southern Peru. And you've got the bird roots, two different bird roots converging here, blue and green. The fun part about this, and you can see right at the top here, there's another bird root that it ends in a seasonal ground, and all these dots are archaeological sites. So this was a pretty popular area. And people would do the farming up here, or again, take from sort of a wild nursery of seeds from up here. The fun part about this is that just to the northwest is an old temple where there used to be a granite obelisk in the middle of a big circular area in front of the temple. And on that obelisk was the image of a raptor dropping peanuts. So again, knowledge that birds carry seeds. And So this is happening roughly at the same time as it was going on the Fertile Crescent in the earliest farming. And you'll find if you go around the whole world, and I'm not going to do that here, similar stories throughout history of farming starting on very busy bird areas. And ultimately people forgot that and they made birds the enemy of farmers, but that happened much later. So the sea voyages, these are always fun. Jason the Argonauts, you'll see a little dove right there, tiny little guy. So following that fella through the clashing rocks, this is looks like a kind of a true story here. With it's a little bit. The dates are kind of off by 1,000 years or so, but you can see that there is a bird route from. This is the Thera Santorini right here, and they settled right here in Cyrene. And the story was they followed ravens to get there. The dates are way off, but that is a bird route that goes right to Cyrene, which is right where they went. So I'm not sure exactly why the dates are so weird. But this is my favorite one. Some Irish heritage. He was St. Brendan was first of all a true mariner. I mean, and an abbot, and he founded monasteries in the Orkneys Islands, which is certainly back then, way the hell off the beaten path. So he was a great mariner. And there were two epic narratives about this voyage, and both of the stories included a gigantic fish so large that it was mistaken for an island. One of my favorite stories is in the Irish version, the voyage of Mael Dwyn, I think it's called, an old bird that washed itself in a lake and grew younger and then flew away. And one of the crew jumped into the lake and was said to never be sick again. So these sound kind of crazy, nutty stories, but as it turns out, holy moly, there's a bird route right from where he took off in County Dingle, which is right where that arrow is, right up to Iceland. And this is the Rockall Plateau, which is a fishery. It's a shallow part of the ocean where there's been a fishery for thousands of years. And where birds would have, there's like 3 volcanic islands that look roughly like that. That's not actually it, but that's off of Iceland, where the birds would rest, which is common, of course, across the world. Birds like to rest along the way. And so it makes sense suddenly that they're talking about amazing amounts of fish and lots of interesting birds, especially a bird that's rejuvenating itself in a rest area on their way to Iceland. So it's like, this is how people used to tell stories. They always exaggerate. But so this kind of confirms that this journey could very easily have happened. In fact, somebody back in the 70s tried it themselves in a period boat, and they got there in 40 days, all the way to Greenland in 40 days. So it was absolutely doable, and probably actually happened, especially when you look at the evidence of the Rockall Plateau with the islands and the birds and the fishery. Of course, this being the bird route. So the Norse, of course, got to Iceland also, but about 300 years later, the St. Brendan's trip would have happened in about 550 or so, mid-6th century. And about 300 years later, Floki comes along, and he had navigated by having a sort of a communal experience with birds, apparently, sort of a ritualistic thing. And when he showed up, the monks just said, we like it quiet, but so, the way it was written in the 12th century was that they just left. They said, we don't need any company. But here's a real big one. Like, how did we get to the Americas? This was all blown up, this whole idea of coming over the land bridge. That was all blown up about 20 years ago, and they kept finding much, much older fossils and settlements in South America and North America, way before 13,000 years. So the land bridge thesis was out the door. This idea came around about 10, 15 years ago, the coastal migration hypothesis, where the ice sheet came down to roughly around here, and that mariners in boats could follow this kelp forest and feed themselves with fish and algae all the way in these little round boats, and that would be about 16,000 years ago. which would be more in line with fossils and the remains that have been found in the Americas. So there's your coastal migration following the kelp forest. But what the study didn't mention was that this kelp forest is, first of all, it's fed by the Ring of Fire. Fed by the Ring of Fire in the same sort of curve, but that's neither here nor there. But it's also fed by, and look at the curve, these bird migration routes, 2 different global flyways that meet all along the kelp forest. And that's one of the reasons the kelp forest is there. These are waterfowl, big birds, like 50 million a year, back and forth twice, dropping their droppings along this air part of the northern Pacific. So the kelp forest, of course, would love that. So if you're going to have this hypothesis, you're the Asian mariner from 16,000 years ago, this is probably an encouraging thing. But seeing birds, like 50 million birds or more take off in that same direction, may have been part of their calculus. I'm like, well, this looks good to me. They're going somewhere, And here's a kelp forest that'll help us get there. So this is kind of the prevailing hypothesis right now, but they just never mentioned this part about the birds. Literally tracking that exactly, tracking the kelp forest exactly. So, and also another reason why they might have followed the birds, these are all Pacific Northwest transformation masks, where they find an ancestor, the soul of an ancestor inside the eagle. And this is across cultures in the Pacific Northwest. So again, if you're an Asian mariner and you're looking at the birds and you're thinking that's our ancestor and he's going to guide me to where I need to go, golden, you're ready to go. So but again, that's speculation, but this was a very common belief. And you can sort of continue to see that belief in mythology of Native Americans in the West, where many different tribes talked about following birds to their homeland. Sometimes they talk about it as first coming from the underworld, but that sort of matches up with a concept of time, that some people looked at time literally, like what's ever below is old, and this is the present and the sky is the future. So that may be what they're talking about in the underworld, but nevertheless it's a very common story that they followed birds to their homeland. It was one of my favorite pieces here, the Tohono O'odham, practicing singing treks. So they've literally followed for hundreds of miles down to the salt flats by Baja, and they would follow the route. The verses would literally tell them how to get from one sacred site to another. So again, it's a bird leading them where they're going. And they also, they believe that their singers learned the melodies of the song. The verses would always stay the same, but they would sing them differently. And those melodies were believed to come from birds in their dreams. This is the front of my book, this piece of work. The Tohono O'odham of southern Arizona. And the Aztec also believed that they were led south by the sun god, who's also known as a hummingbird of the left. And one of my favorite stories is that Montezuma sent a search party to find their homeland, and they arrived at the birthplace of the sun god, who turned them all into birds to get to their homeland. So another clue about how people viewed them. The Inca Royal Roads. You can kind of see yourself the correlation. These are the roads. There's the mountain road and a coastal road, and they link up pretty well with these bird routes. And the strange thing about these roads is, while of course the Inca used them as power control, for their empire, there were many, many areas that went through extremely high elevation areas that had nobody living there. And we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of miles, 14,000 feet. I mean, people did not live up there. Usually if you're doing a procession with your king, you're going through town after town and showing how cool you are and how strong you are. Why the heck were they going up into these, desolate, really hard to engineer? And they were over-engineered. These roads were over-engineered. There were lots of stuff like this, And there were canals on either side, water culverts on either side, all the way along. They spent an incredible amount of money on this. One of the possibilities is that this is the Inca king wearing these feathers on top, is that they related to birds. The kings of lots of cultures had to basically show people that they were in tune with birds because they brought seeds. This is part of your sort of cycle of life, and that your king had better have his finger on this. So one of the possibilities is that they would follow. That they were they were following migratory bird routes, and it was sort of almost a spiritual journey or something that the elite would sort of need to learn and understand. And of course, it would also separate the wheat from the chaff, in the royal family, doing this kind of crazy stuff up at these high elevations. But it sort of reminded me of a very well-known book, The Conference of the Birds, which was all about a journey through 7 valleys. And it was a spiritual journey, and along the way, lots of birds were like, I'm beat, I'm done, forget it. And they would learn sort of a spiritual backbone through following these the hoopoe. So this is getting towards the end now, where we've got a sort of a whole other plane of belief, and that is of the spiritual plane. That cultures around the world, ancient and indigenous, believed that birds carried souls, human souls, to the afterlife. And it's, I found so many examples of this that I couldn't possibly show you all of them. But the oldest ones were the sky burials, where the vultures, consume the body and then fly the soul to the heavens. And the Celts of Spain believed that, but it goes way further back. To again southeastern Turkey, where you can see those vultures. That's a human head right there, just the head, pecking away at the head. And of course, back then the soul was believed to be in the head, and so that sort of makes sense that they would be pecking at that. And nearby again at Göbekli Tepe, which we talked about before, you have a headless person right there, holding onto a bird. Looks kind of like a vulture. And then you've got this guy, another vulture, holding what could be a head right there. So, considering the Catalhoya, because I'm not sure how to say that right, but it's right nearby, this is almost certainly more, belief in sky burials, going back to 11,500 years ago. If you're reading this yourself, this is relatively recent evidence finding that the skulls were removed from dead bodies that were buried under people's homes in the villages around, and then at some point later returned to the bodies. So it's certainly possible they brought these heads to Göbekli Tepe, which has been determined to be a religious site, not a place where people live, but a religious site, and have the vultures sort of peck out their soul, so to speak. And then you've got, in Egypt, you've got Isis bringing Osiris back from the dead, and this was one of the quotes from about it was, that she originated coolness with her wings, and brought it back to life. Certainly, in almost every tomb you're going to find this bird right at the top of these huge murals, overseeing basically the afterlife. And I love this one. This is obviously a bird person. The idea that the boss soul would fly during the day in the sunlight, and then return at night to transfer that energy to the corpse. Again, we're talking about some afterlife beliefs here related to, enabled by birds. This is a lovely quote here, where the ashes of King Memnon turned into birds on the funeral pyre, and that's, you see these little birds up here in the ashes. And similar practices in Rome, where they released eagles at burials, very common at funerals. This is on the website of the Tomb of the Eagles. It's obviously a made-up thing here. But the tomb of the eagle is 5,200 years old in Scotland, and they found lots and lots of human remains as well as lots and lots of sea eagles. And sea eagles are scavengers, so it's perhaps similar to the function of the vulture. And this was used for something like 500 or 600 years. This tomb in the Orkney Islands, again, way up north. And in Native Americans, also tons of evidence that birds were involved in the afterlife. You can look at this bird right here. That is the tomb with buried bodies inside, and you find this type of bird, copper, often copper, across really probably a dozen or more Native American cultures, certainly in Mississippian style. In South America, the Andean condor was a scavenger. And the condor was right at the top of the pyramid as far as the pantheon of gods in the Andes, going back thousands of years. You can see the head. Whoops, this little beak right there, and this is something you came across a couple years ago. It's hard to sort of read this, but it is a vulture chewing on an arm, Nazca lines, and these are pots that could have been filled with crabs. They've found about 5 years ago a whole bunch of broken pots and broken seashells built into these walls at these altars. And I thought to myself, I wonder if they smashed these pots full of live shellfish just to attract the condors because of the smell, to get them down to do their job of devouring the people, the dead people. So that makes sense to me, but there's no video, so we don't know. The Moche, who were before the Inca, they had mummies. They used to wrap them in cloth that was decorated like this. Those are people. Those are heads, people's heads, in the wings of the bird here with the claws. So again, these were used for mummies. So again, sort of with the afterlife. And a lot of evidence to show that cultures would gather the bones of the year's dead in England and the British Isles, in that area, also for Native Americans, and they would have a ceremony in late fall to release the souls from the bones. And there's more, to get into the actual evidence, it takes too long, but there's good evidence for it. And the timing is sort of perfect because bird migration starts in late October, around mid-September through early November. And if that's when they were holding these ceremonies, well, that's when the birds were taken off, going beyond the horizon, taking the souls with them. So where were they going? Well, we know how far away the stars are, but they didn't. And they assumed, people in ancient indigenous cultures assumed they were in the general neighborhood. They were reachable. You could get there. Birds could get there. And so there's a whole long list of rivers that were believed to join up to the Milky Way. Often it was with mountains, stories of mountains, or high lakes that would, be filled up with water from the Milky Way. But certainly across the northern hemisphere, you get the same belief that the Milky Way was the road of souls and also the path of migratory birds. And they were migrating to the celestial pole and returning. And that's captured in the Finnish epic Kalevala, where it's just really straightforward. Swans take the souls along the Milky Way, called the Linunrata, and then they do this nice trick when they get to the celestial pole. They pop out through to the land of rest. You can see this lovely land of rest called Tuonela around the pole, and so that coincided with the movement of the Cygnus constellation. Every year, goes up and over the pole, and then back down in the spring, and brings new souls. Oh! And you can see why they kind of put two and two together there, with the swans carrying, the way they were able to carry these little creatures. And that's it. Sorry, I gotta go back and see some of the slides again. That's it. That's all I got. There's a whole lot more in the book. There's a lot more territory that's covered there. But the maps they really just put together in the last 6 months, it just was kind of blown away by how the correlation was so strong. That to me, I'm beyond convinced that this is how it worked. I mean, it makes sense that they would have the ecological awareness to follow sort of the birds as an indicator of biodiversity. I mean, if they understood that these migratory birds were an indicator of the best ecosystems around, that they would follow them. And wherever they were going to go, they're going to end up someplace nice. And it was true. I mean, that is the case. And it is partly because those bird routes, again, they go through volcanic areas all the time. They crisscross through volcanic areas that have this sort of perpetual fertile soil. Which is going to give you a lot better chance of a variety of food. So it makes sense. It makes common sense. It's just a little bit about what? When you first sort of wade into this territory. But it does. Anyway, I'm convinced. I don't know if it works. Thanks again.
So we know that whales follow, they follow electrical. They follow.
Magnetic.
Magnetic.
Yeah.
Right. Do birds follow magnetic?
Yes, ornithologists believe that birds can read and there's been a lot of study on this, that birds can read the magnetic, if you look at a map, there's sort of these curves of magnetic lines around the globe, and they say that they can sort of tune in on those magnetic lines. I think it also may have everything to do with the fact that volcanoes are magnetic. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you heat up ore like that, it's permanently magnetic. And for whatever reason, ornithologists that I contact don't even bother to call me back or email me back or anything when I ask these questions. It's like, because the correlation, I don't have the maps with me, but the correlation, if you put a migratory bird map on the volcano map, it's like bingo. I mean, they correlate really closely. And so I'm like, well, if they see, and they know now that the magnetism actually shows up in their eyes as like a color or something. And so if they're, flying, can you imagine anything more like signposts to their migration is like, oh, there's the volcano. I can see it, reading out as magnetic. So it's certainly when you look at it, kind of like, well, they could be following those if they know how to read magnetism. But science has just no interest in that at this point. Nobody's sort of making anything of that except me. So I'm a wacko, right? But it's like, I don't understand why it's not more of a thing.
So if you look at the migration of people, I'm thinking that you would be looking at people living along rivers. Mm-hmm. So how does this correlate with the rivers?
Well, birds they're always that's their habitat. Rivers, rivers, deltas. I mean, one of the reasons why I think I probably didn't make that clear enough about following birds being a smart thing was that these routes never stray far from fresh water or bountiful ecosystems. I mean, birds don't go places where it's dry as dust. And certainly waterfowl is named for that. Live in the same types of places that humans have always lived in coves, estuaries, deltas, big giant rivers as corridors. Like the Nile is a huge bird migration corridor. That's probably my bad for not being clear about that at the beginning. But yeah, that's birds and fresh water go together like peanut butter and jelly.
I have more, but
okay. Yes, Matthew, you got something?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just thinking. So I grew up next door to a Chalmette totem pole carver in Victoria, British Columbia, and he told my friend, his kid was my friend, and he used to tell us stories that were mostly foundational myths, and they were endlessly fascinating. And one of them involved basically him saying that the Thunderbird brought life. And I never thought about it till this moment, but years later I was in the woods on the mainland of British Columbia, like deep in the woods, parts of the woods that have grizzly bears. But we came across like this really weird, like remnants, I guess, of an indigenous village. I don't know how old it would have been. I don't know, like, what do I know? I was 19 years old. But you could still make out the carvings of the birds, and you could still kind of see that there actually had been some agriculture in this village. This is way inland too. This is not on the coast. This is way inland. I just kind of found, it just kind of popped back into my head here. It's kind of fascinating. And
there's a couple of bird routes that go through BC.
Yeah.
You find a whole lot of medicine wheels.
yes,
And that's a correlation too. And the thunderbird, it goes back to the Sumerians. They had Inerta, and in ancient China they had dragons. And the thunderbird is the same. In both cases they would flash lightning from their claws, and the wind and the thunder from their wings. And they were associated with storms because they would show up in the spring with the rain and the storms. And so, boom, thunderbird. I mean, they were conflated together, the storms and the birds, as they arrived together with the seas. So all that stuff was celebrated, every year. And often was related to Cygnus, the constellations. Everybody saw birds up in the various constellations, whether you're in the north hemisphere or the southern hemisphere. There are these birds there. So, it's I absolutely tied in with farming. Yep. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the Americas. I didn't want to go on and on and on here. So there's a lot more maps and stuff that I've gone through, but after a while, it's like, yes.
You have an enormous amount of information about ancient times,
Yeah.
and mythical times, and human times, old times. Did any of your research lead you to contemporary human groups that are exemplifying your hypothesis?
Yeah, I mean, the thing the evidence along those lines that was the most sort of amazing thing was when I went and looked at the fossil record using Google Earth and just zeroing in on the sites where the fossils were found. They always found serpentine rivers, always like this, just wicked curvy rivers, right? You're like, well, yeah, they're everywhere, right? Well, not really. They're not always curvy. Sometimes they're straight, but the correlation was huge. So. What I found was that, and of course these curvy rivers would always be in intense bird migration corridors. And what it told me when I found myths about birds and snakes are always tied together. And when birds would literally, copulate with snakes and produce humans. I mean, Quetzalcoatl, the Inca Maya feathered serpent, made humans from our ancestors' bones combined with his Quetzal bird blood and his rattlesnake blood. And so this is something you find around the world. So I kind of went, okay, they're actually being literal here. They're talking about bird migration corridors with these cool, serpentine rivers where you have this very intense biomass because you have all this riverbank. As opposed to a straight river, you've got this river doing this, you've got like 5 times the food in a concentrated area. Because the riverbank is where you get all the toads and the amphibians and all the good stuff. The more riverbank you have, the more there is to eat. So what I found was that the capital cities around the world are on serpentine rivers on bird migration routes. And this is, Paris, Beijing, Pyongyang, all over the place. And in the United States, all the original capitals were on bird migration routes with these wicked serpentine rivers on them. And only about 120 years ago, I looked at the original capitals, and in some cases they moved the capitals. If they moved them after World War I, they didn't necessarily match up anymore with bird migration corridors or snaky rivers. But before that point, they all did. I mean, everyone. So it was part of the understanding, even up to that recently, that this is where people needed to settle, is on these snaky rivers in heavily traveled bird migration areas or on the seasonal grounds of migratory birds. And I was blown away by how consistent that was. So it comes up to very recently in terms of sort of passed on knowledge that I think after World War I was just lost. I think a lot of things were lost after World War I. It was like, oh, that didn't work, so let's try some new stuff. But yeah, that's as close as I could come. And certainly plenty of indigenous cultures still believe, in birds and sort of the afterlife journey is enabled by birds in one way or another. And that's still true, at least up until people started getting the internet and the Amazon. So.
And are there current migratory groups of humans who follow those kinds of routes?
Bird. Obviously, humans can't be as migratory as birds because they can't go as far. But humans have been migratory until really, really recently. All the farmers in North and South America were migratory for thousands of years before they settled. People equate farming with settling down, and that's true in the Near East, but it wasn't true in the Americas, and it wasn't true everywhere. They would farm in the summer in the highlands, and then in the winter they would be down at a lake somewhere, eating the grain that they harvested. So their migrations that way up and down is what you find in all hominins, but obviously at a much smaller scale. And certainly when you talk about birds, the tiniest birds can go thousands of miles from Beijing to East Africa, but a waterfowl like a swan, well, as far as it's going to go is from Iceland to Ireland. That's because they weigh 25 pounds. They're not going to go much further. And raptors, for example, might just migrate a couple hundred miles. But if you live where the raptors are in the summer and they're gone, you don't know where the hell they went, but they're just like 200 miles down the road. That's pretty common for raptors.
It sounds like human beings could actually follow the raptors. Like you mentioned a group. You mentioned a migration that took 40 days for humans to
Sea
do.
voyage, yeah.
And then I was wondering how long does it take
migration?
for the birds to do it?
Yeah, the interesting thing about that is that certainly there are two intense periods of about a month where those corridors are just going to be filled with birds and you'll be able to tell where it's going.
Yeah.
But it's like a superhighway system. It's never unused. It's like a lot of these are right on the coast where you just get tons of birds. And so, if you were living in nature, you'd probably figure out what the signs were that you were still on the right route. And if you really wanted to figure it out, you could go to a high place in migratory season and see that they're headed towards that mountain, 25 miles away, and go there and then go to another high place and see where they're going. So there are lots of different ways of doing it. But yeah, no, that was one of the things I asked myself when I was looking at this. Well, it only lasts for a couple of months. How could they just keep following them? Well, the evidence would probably, like you say, it's like a highway system.
But they could be following the evidence too. They
Yes,
could be following because you said that the birds are it's organic, but they're creating this biodiversity.
Right.
So
you could follow that evidence,
yeah.
Yeah.
But I have another question for you. So we have like 1/3 or something the number of birds that we used to have. So how
That's
does
the
that?
last chapter of my book is about what's gone on in the last 50 years, where in North America has lost 1/4 of its birds since 1970. That's just terrifying to me. 1/4. We have 3/4 what we had 50 years ago. That's pretty awful. And one of the reasons that I was trying to get interested in getting the book out there was for people to respect them, to sort of respect their role in our history. Instead of treating them like, whatever. Migratory birds, so what? Well, we wouldn't be here, I think, if we hadn't been following them around and finding out, for the best places to live thanks to them. So, not that they know anything about it, but, and farmers initially gave them all the credit in the world, and then over time, the birds turned into enemies of the farmers. And so certainly farming has had a lot to do with breaking up those rest areas, those areas where they would stop on their migration. Now suddenly it's an industrial farm; they can't stop there anymore, or whatever. It's just a huge problem. And there are lots of international groups, and they're trying to sort of build back together these sort of bio corridors to try to improve their chances. There's certainly a lot of people working on it. It's sort of time will tell in the next century or so, I think. But yeah, there used to be a lot more.
Do you explore the spiritual element of there are deities that are bird beings, and you mentioned a little bit in the.
Oh yeah, no, I just showed you a few. There's so much more. In the book, there's a whole lot more examples of that. I was kind of astonished at how consistent when I would do the research, you go, oh, there's another one, there's another bird god, there's another afterlife journey, there's another, it's really, really common to believe that. And even today, I mean, when I talk to people about this, they're like, oh, at my uncle's funeral, there was an eagle circling over it, and I was like, it was meaningful to them. I mean, really meaningful. And that's, I think there's a book by Evan Pritchard, who is, I think a Micmac, who has just a whole book full of these stories about spiritual birds and the spiritual plane.
At my father-in-law's funeral, which was up in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, up on a hill, as it was going on, it seemed like thousands of seagulls were flying over.
Flying around it, yeah.
It was just was spine chilling.
Yeah, I think we have these memories deep in our souls, or this was so much more a part of life, so much more a part of our belief system, that I feel like people still have some kind of native memory of the significance and why your spine would tingle when you look up. It's like, oh my goodness, that, why would it? It's like, well, you're carrying knowledge maybe that has been around for a long, long time. Of course, until the Bible listed all the sacred birds and said that they were all unclean. So, way to go.
There are also sculptures, giant sculptures that you can't
Everywhere.
see unless you're up above of birds. And
yeah, the Nazca lines, and that's also in the book. All of those. I think I should have put this in there. I have a map that shows like all the geoglyphs, which is what you're talking about, all through North and South America. They correlate perfectly with again bird migration routes, and you will not find a single one that's outside of the bird migration route.
cool, very cool.
So they're all like that. In fact, there are a couple of towns in New Mexico, little native Apache or Hopi towns, Kure and something else, that where their boundaries were drawn in the shape, one of a mockingbird and the other of a goose. And again, nobody could see it except from above, but they felt they were communicating with their divine messengers. I mean, the migratory birds were thought to be the agents of the sun, because after all, they follow the sun back and forth every year. They live in a perpetual summer, these migratory birds. If you're on the ground, you're like, well, it's winter again, the birds are gone, they're following the sun. Pretty smart. Right? So they were perceived as messengers and agents of the sun. So they would bring the seeds, and the sun would grow the seeds. So it's all tied together.
There's some time ago, that was not that long ago, it was considered kind of a bizarre theory that there was once a Pangea, although people looked at maps and said, oh, those things fit together.
Yeah.
But my husband remembers being a child and
Yeah, me
discovering
too.
that and being told by his teacher,
Exactly.
no, of course not. And now it's commonly accepted.
Yeah.
So my question, based on that, is what would be the turning point or the evidence or whatever that would kind of draw attention to your theory and make it more
Boy, if only
commonly held?
If only I had something I could wave around like that. Because at some point you have to. This is just a giant pile of circumstantial evidence. I mean, it's just a huge pile of circumstantial evidence that you can say, well, people went where the water was and the rivers were. Duh. Well, yeah, they did. But when you look at when it's just I think what I would like to do is find a mathematician and do a probability study, if that's possible, of how probable is it that there are no hominid fossils where there are no bird roots, and that the huge majority of the world does not have these bird roots on them. Yes, birds are everywhere, but those maps that you saw, those are the super highways of bird migration, those are the roots.
Yeah,
Those
and
are the biggest ones there are.
Yeah.
And if you only find hominids on the biggest roots and nowhere else, to me that's just like, well, what else could it be? I mean, there's got to be a meaningful correlation, at that point, because the vast majority of the world does not have that size roots. So there's one, for example, that runs through the Catskills, north-south down through sort of western Mass, even further west than here. And so you kind of know if you're living on a bird route. I met someone who grew up in Sri Lanka, which has 3 converging flyways, and she described just her childhood as just filled with birds, and she thought that was the way it was everywhere. And then she would go to other places in the world and go, where'd all the birds go? You know?
Well, I'm trying
So
to-
yeah, it's the correlation. I don't know.
I don't
the
know what the
magic sort of-
science was that led to the recognition that the continents were,
Oh yeah,
joined
continental
ones.
drift. Yeah.
or what the equivalent science would be. If there is equivalent
The
science,
problem with
yeah.
the birds is that the fossil record is basically non-existent. I mean, they're so tiny, their bones are so small. You can't, you know, you can find human fossils, you can't find bird fossils. You know, and you really can't. I mean, it's just very rare, and so it's really, you know, the evidence is correlation, and not. And well, it's also the bird routes themselves. You kind of have to get people to understand that the bird routes haven't changed. That they are the same as they always were. The birds will go further north and further south depending on how cool or warm the planet is, but they use the same routes once it cools up and warms up again.
So how is that known then, that they use the same routes?
Well, ornithologists believe that,
Okay.
based on the fact that the routes are the most efficient way of flying. They avoid bodies of water, and they again correlate with volcanic mountain ranges that are thermal. And so the more heat you have coming up, the easier it is to fly. So that's so consistent on the maps that they're like, well, this is, any other route would have been less efficient for them to use. So it's kind of a deduction that ornithologists make. They say, well, they were always like this, or they were established this way through natural process of natural selection. These are the areas that are most efficient to fly and had the most vegetative resources and were the most perpetually fertile. So it's just like, you know, again, if it correlates so highly with volcanism, volcanoes don't move. So, you know, but again, it's something you have to kind of convince people, well, they've always been like this. So you can look at bird migration routes as literally a window onto the past and find all this fascinating evidence. But I mean, I know for sure that I'm the only one who's done this because I've been studying it for years. And no one else has overlaid the fossil record on bird migration routes, despite the fact that ornithologists believe they've stayed the same for millions of years. So, you know, I'm swimming against the stream.
Yeah.
Yes.
You've made me think about it completely differently. I've always thought that rivers that converge are holy places, and I never thought about airstreams. You know, that's a whole new
Rivers and birds.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's very, very cool.
Yeah, they often correlate with you know, converging rivers. And you, again, like I said, when you find fossil remains on these serpentine rivers, you also find them where rivers converge. It's the same sort of U-shaped area. If you're an archaeologist and you see converging rivers, you go, well, let's dig there, you know, because there's so much evidence of people living right where rivers converge, forming this tight U shape.
And I had a little question. Just this is a technical thing, but you mentioned ape-human hybrids, and in my mind, I think all of the pre-human. They're obviously not all in the same line as Homo sapiens sapien. They're all the ones that died out, that didn't make it. But I don't think of them as hybrids, you know.
Well,
so
that's before
yeah.
the hominids. The first 10 that I showed you were pre-Homo. These were not hominids. They were literally ape-human hybrids. Once you get to Homo erectus, now we're into humans, right? So that's the difference. The cutoff when Homo erectus or Homo habilis showed up.
Yeah, I guess it's the term ape-human hybrid that I don't understand, because
Yeah.
I'm thinking, you know, there's Homo habilis, Homo erectus. And
Right, and those are all
the different.
human, yeah. But everything that came before that, all 10, at least 10,
Yes.
from 6 different genus or genera,
Yes.
they were
their own thing.
they were their own thing. I mean, they were. I mean, it's accurate to call them ape-human hybrids. I mean,
Okay,
that's what
sure it is.
scientists.
It's
scientists
just
call
a
it. Yeah.
term that I haven't heard.
It's a term that's out there that's used to describe them in the human evolution. Yeah, yeah. So first you get all those different ape humans, and then you get Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and at that point it really starts looking more like us. I mean, Homo erectus looks pretty much like we do.
Yeah.
I mean, they developed a nose about 1.6 million years ago. Then the bony protrusion showed up, and once that happened, they look pretty much like us.
So going back even further.
Yeah.
And remembering that, at least if this is still the theory, that birds are the present day dinosaurs.
Yes.
Do the dinosaur remains also
Oh,
follow this
Concept.
pathway?
well, now we're talking about Pangea. We're talking about when the continents really were all one big mass.
Right, and do we
So I haven't looked into
do we
that
have
as far
a
as.
map of where the volcanic action was in those days, and does it
Yeah.
correlate with where?
Good question. You know, I should probably do a little Googling on that, but I
Yeah,
haven't.
maybe
I
that's
haven't
your
done
sequel.
that yet. I'm having a hard enough time convincing people this is real. And everyone, the dinosaurs. Yeah, the dinosaurs weren't feathered. I mean, when they discovered that there's a whole bunch of dinosaurs that were feathered,
Yeah,
you know, that's what led to the discovery that yes,
yeah.
birds were among the 25% of species that survived the comet strike, whatever it was, 66 million years ago. So obviously an incredibly successful species. I mean, that's why I think it makes sense that if you were booted out of your chimp tribe, the most successful creatures around were the hundreds of millions of birds and 1,000 different species of color and music and coming and going. These were successful creatures, right? So to me, it makes sense that these sort of outcasts would go, oh, follow them. You know, they're obviously very successful at what they do. They disappear for 6 months and come back again every year. So you know, it certainly correlates with you know the sort of foundational you know journey story that humans tell. You know, the foundation of literature is the journey story. So it makes sense to me that this would start as a journey long, well, sort of long before we thought maybe that was a thing.
That was great.
All right, thank you.
Yay.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.